going to start with these slides. This kind of summarize where we are, right? So we are in the chapter understand the fiscal policy. Okay, we understand there are expansionary fiscal policy and then contractionary fiscal policy. And then another way to look at fiscal policy is discretionary versus automatic stabilizer. Right. So that's what we have learned understanding regarding to the fiscal policy. Now we are entered the last part of this class, for this fiscal policy, which understand the debt, how fiscal policy is related to debt. Look at here. So by the way, this is outdated, right? So if you click the button and click the button here, you're going to see the real-time debt clock I've shown you in last class. Right now it's 32 trillion. And 120% of the total GDP. And if you pay attention to the news, and yesterday the Congress just passed the legislation to raise the debt limit. Now this bill is go to the Senate, right? But certainly understand the debt ceiling is like part of the things we are going to discuss today. But now the key things is why the government accumulate so much debt, right? So essentially it's coming from this equation. Okay. On the right hand side, T stands for tax revenue, G is government spending, TR is transfer. So basically on the right hand side is what? Okay, you can rewrite this is essentially the income for the government. This last two term is a spending. So whenever your income is more than your spending, and then you're going to have saving. Whenever your income is less than your spending, then you're running into deficit. But now the question is, if there's a deficit, what are you going to do? How are you going to finance spending? Again, deficit means you spend more than your income you have. But how are you going to finance those things? So the answer to that is borrowing debt, right? For now, I would like to write down the equation, like kind of expand the equation, but we are going to use that equation later. So the equation as follows. First of all, the government is going to borrow. Let's say, for example, so they have some debt, right? So from the past. And then, so each period they can borrow, let's use code D plus, meaning this is something you can own. You have to pay off next period. So the debt usually, so you're going to use the price of Q. What this means is, if I borrow $1 or $100, okay, whichever you like, and the price just says, okay, so you're going to, for $1, you're going to receive, say, for example, 95 cents. That's the price. You promise to pay $1 when it's due, and from there you can infer the interest rate. Does it make sense? Lower the price, higher the interest rate, right? Higher the price, lower the interest rate. Is it clear? Okay. Now with this preparation, we can extend this equation. The government now you have two sources of income. One is T, like we wrote here. And additionally, let me read down. So besides T, the government can also have income from Q. So that's the debt they're going to issue. Q times D plus. Does this make sense? It doesn't make sense. Because they can borrow. But then, so they have to something they have to pay, or there's a spending. That's why they need to tax. That's why they need to borrow. What they need to pay? Government spending. Transfer. Right? Transfer. Like sometimes they need to stimulate the economy. Transfer. And then what else? So in this case, the government also needs to pay the debt that is due. All right, so now we extend this equation to this one. But this one is going to tell us the connection. It's going to tell us the connection between deficit and debt. All right, so that's what happened. Just imagine, if T, or if this one always equal to 0, if this equal to 0, by looking at this equation, do you think is there any need for government to borrow? If T equal to G plus TR, meaning this term on the left-hand side is going to cancel with the right-hand side, there's no point in borrow, right? So you don't extra spending need to borrow, right? So from here, you can immediately see the connection between deficit and the debt. On the other hand, so if you have lots of things to spend, like meaning the right-hand side, G plus TR is higher than T. And then to satisfy this equation, what you must do? The only way you can do is to increase borrowing. Does that make sense? So if you, again, so if you have a lot of deficit, and then so you must increase your borrowing so that you can finance deficit. This is second. Now the third, let's see, so what is the impact of high debt? Let's say for example, you have a lot of debt accumulated from the past. Either there's a war, or there's a big project you need to do. So that just means on the right-hand side, the total spending is going to be high. Correct? To satisfy this equation, what do you must do? You either increase T or decrease G, decrease TR. Or alternatively, you can borrow. Right? So you can see, so the more debt you have, meaning so you are going to have raise tax, reduce current spending, reduce transfer, or you borrow more. Does that make sense? But now, so this comes with cost. The cost is that, so the more debt you have to raise tax, reduce G, reduce TR. Now, what happens if you are in a recession? That just means the more data you have from the past, then there's less room for you to carry out expansionary fiscal policy. All right, so this is one. On the other hand, if you have a lot of debt, okay, and economically, this is something I will explain to you a little bit in detail later. This Q is going to fall. But this is pretty intuitive, right? Just think about yourself. If you reach your credit card limit, or if you have a lot of debt, either from mortgage, from student loan, from car loans, if you want to borrow more, do you think your interest rate is going to higher or lower? It's going to higher. Why is it going to higher? There are more risk to the creditor, right? So the more you borrow, and then so the more likely you cannot repay, right? So you can see then, so the higher debt is going to also create some trouble to you, meaning so when you need to borrow, but then so your price is going to fall, meaning the borrowing cost is going to rise. Remember the relationship between Q and the interest rate. Is this part clear? Okay. Now from this equation, this expanded equation kind of tell you the relationship between deficit and the debt. Also tells you what would happen if you have a lot of debt, right? So the more debt you have, and then the smaller room you have whenever you need stimulate the economy. And the more debt you have, usually it's going to cause higher borrowing costs, further squeeze your physical space, meaning so you can change T or change G toward the direction you would like, right? So that's the problem with more debt. So that's why sometimes there's discussion. We want to maintain the level of debt. There's a good reason. Now, but certainly borrowing is also necessary. So there's a subtle balance we need to strike. But it's coming up in one of the slides I'm going to show you later. But now let's look at, just summarize, just finish this part, right? So if the government carry out expansionary fiscal policy, and usually that's going to make the deficit larger. what is the expansionary fiscal policy? Means you're going to reduce tax, increase G, increase TR, right? So that just means on the very top is becomes more likely to the negative or more negative, meaning you're going to have more deficit. But then, so the more deficit you have, and then the more debt it's going to have. So actually, that's how we accumulate it over time. On the other hand, if there's a contractionary fiscal policy, usually that's going to reduce your deficit because you're going to have more tax, you're going to have lower spending, lower transfer, right? And then, so if we look at the historic data in the US, you can see, so the government most of the time run deficit, except, oh, this is like very briefly, but primarily here, 1990, later of 1990, that's the second term of president, the second term of Clinton administration. Okay, most of the time we run in the deficit. And furthermore, from this graph, you can see the deficit usually increase during recession. Right, look here, look at here, and pretty much everywhere. But there are two reasons why deficit increase during recession. Reason number one, because the government usually is going to carry out discretionary expansionary fiscal policy, stimulate the economy, right? By decreased tax, increased spending, or increased transfer. On the other hand, during recession, even without any expansionary fiscal policy, what happened to your tax revenue? It's going to fall. Why? Unemployment, right? The GDP falls, right? So that's why the deficit usually is going to increase with the recession. Look at here. Let's just try to explain to you. So the deficit is just follow with unemployment, or they track with each other, highly correlated. Why is highly correlated? Is because, I mean, two reasons, right? So one, when unemployment rise, usually government want to stimulate the economy or to help the economy by using expansionary fiscal policy. This is one. Number two, high unemployment means lower income, means lower tax revenue. Yeah. But this also motivates us to define a new term, which is called cyclically adjusted budget balance. Oh, by the way, budget balance essentially is the difference between tax and spending. What is cyclically adjusted? It's because your balance or your deficit is going to change in your balance or deficit. It's going to caused by two different reasons. One is your fiscal policy. The other is the business cycle itself. And then here, we want to calculate a cyclically adjusted budget to tease out the impact of business cycle. Because business cycle, so this is something out of your control, right? Because if you do nothing, you still have fluctuation in your budget. Now we're going to tease out that, and then the cyclically adjusted budget is purely coming from your fiscal policy itself. Right. So that's what we have, and clearly, so it's less volatile, the adjusted. So this one is actual, and this one is adjusted. So you can see it's less volatile. The difference is caused by the business cycle, right? Well, in other words, we use this cyclically adjusted budget balance to kind of the judge or can to evaluate the government. Right. Now go to the bond or go to the debt. Like I showed you earlier, there's an equation. So if there's a deficit, and then you have to finance with the debt. But how the debt is going to implement? So usually the government issue a IOU. This probably is like in 19. I think probably this is during the World War I, or maybe Civil War. I'm not sure. Right. In any case, okay. So this is like one example. So the government issue a IOU So for example, they just issue the face value is $100. And then so at the return, you give the government $95. And then when this mature, and then you can come to the government give you $100. So that's how it is. Then so the price is going to reflect the interest rate. Right? So the lower the price, higher the interest rate. Right? But then so the interest rate is going to reflect your risk. If the government is more responsible, and then the interest rate is going to lower. It's less responsible, and then the interest rate is going to higher. Right. Let's look at this practice question. Holding everything else constant, the government's deficit, A, tends to increase during a recession. That's correct, right? Even though you don't have any change in your fiscal policy, your deficit is going to rise. Why? Because the income is going to fall, tax is going to fall. B is certainly is not correct. And C will increase if the government pursue expansion of fiscal policy. That's correct, right? So actually A and C, that explain why the deficit will increase during recession. But there are two different nature, right? One is just business cycle itself. The other is the government's active policy choice. So the answer is D. A and C, they are both correct. Okay. So from the earlier discussion, we understand there are correlation, there's strong relationship between deficit and debt. In the extreme case, if there's no deficit, there's no point of debt. Right? And if you have keep rounding the surplus, and then so you're going to reduce your debt, and eventually you have some saving. Right? And furthermore, I showed you earlier, the high debt is going to lead to higher borrowing costs. It's going to squeeze your physical space. Right? So maybe you just rewrite this equation here. So the earlier equation we have is, so the government has T, tax revenue, plus they can borrow, right? So borrow is going to Q, that's the price, times D. I use D plus, okay, so this is borrowing. This is borrowing for the future. You're going to, this is due in the future. The plus means in the future, right? So this is equal to, usually greater than or equal to, and then your spending. This spending includes G, this is what you need to finance, and you have some transfer, right? So this second term, transfer. Okay, what else? What else do you remember? There's a third term, debt, right? So the debt from the past. Okay, so you can see clearly, so like I said earlier, so first of all, you see the correlation, you see the relationship between deficit and the debt, right? So deficit means T, this term, is less than these two terms. And you balance these, you must increase the borrowing. This is number one. Okay, deficit leads to more borrowing. Number two, so now if you have a lot of debt from the past, what you can do? You must reduce T. Sorry, you must increase T or reduce G and TR. Right? Alternatively, yes, you can keep borrowing, but you don't want. So from here you can see, so deficit leads to more debt, and the debt is going to squeeze your space. Squeeze the space means, so when you have a lot of debt, and then so usually so you can't reduce tax too much, you can't increase these things too much whenever you need, right? Hence there's a discussion regarding to balanced budget. What is balanced budget? Okay, and balanced budget is T equal to G plus TR. If you just keep running a balanced budget, there's no discussion of that, because except you start with some debt, like in 1776, when the America was founded. Okay, so the countries already own some debt to France. Yeah, they need to borrow to finance the war against England. Right, so just give you an example. Right, if there's no such debt, and then so if you keep running the balanced budget, no debt issue. So that's why there's a discussion about a balanced budget. Again, what is balanced budget? In the written narrow term means T equal to G plus TR. In the broader term means, so the difference between T and the G and the TR is small, or in other words, you will have a small deficit. Now let's see, so what is cost and the benefit of requiring the budget balance? If we require an annual balanced budget, and then what happened? Let's just think about here. So if you are in a recession, you want that this, basically you don't have these two, right? So you don't, let me write it here. So if you have balanced budget, in extreme case, you have T equal to G plus TR, right? So this is a balanced budget. Now in the recession, if you want to balance your budget, what you must do? Because in the recession, usually these things fall, right? And now in order to balance the budget, you must reduce the G, right? Reduce TR. But we already knew this is what? This is a contractionary fiscal policy. You are going to make the recession deep. As a matter of fact, this is what President Hoover did in his first term. When Great Depression hit, he was trying to balance budget and he asked everyone to calm down. But that was the wisdom at that point of time. But now we understand, so if we have recession, you keep balancing the budget, you're going to make things worse. Certainly, that's a cost of running a balanced budget, right? If you are forced to run a balanced budget, you lose the ability to stimulate the economy when you need to do that. So this is cost. But then there has some benefit. What is the benefit? I already mentioned one, right? So if you run in a balanced budget, and then you don't need to worry about the debt issue. There's another reason people may argue for balanced budget. Okay, just imagine, or just ask yourself, do you like high tax or low tax as an individual? I guess no one likes high tax. Do you like government to spend more on you or less on you? More, right? So that's a human, as an individual, you like lower tax, you want to receive more, either like your parents or the government. Now, if that's the case, and then so that actually means the government must run a deficit. If the government runs a deficit, and then so that means debt is going to accumulate, right? But now, so if you like that, so the politicians, they are going to listen to you, quote unquote, listen to you, right? And then the easiest way for them to win the re-election or win the election is what? To promise lower tax, higher spending. Some may prefer like lower tax, some may prefer higher spending. Now, in either case, the most convenient and the most effective way to keep them in power is what? Running deficit, right? So hence, if we require a balanced budget, in some sense, you put some physical discipline on the politician. So that just go back to the earlier history. So in the United States, why there was a debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling was created to impose some physical responsibility on the government. But anyway, since it was started, so this debt ceiling has been revised more than 70 times. Okay, for now, let's make sure I understand. Okay, so this balanced budget has the cost and the benefit. What is the cost? You are losing some ability when you want to stimulate the economy. What is the benefit? It's going to impose some physical discipline. Right? Furthermore, regarding the cost, remember there are two costs, right? At least one is, so the deficit leads to debt. And then furthermore, the more debt you have, in the long term, you're going to have less room to adjust your budget. And then furthermore, you may face higher borrowing costs. Does that make sense? So these higher borrowing costs, so the extreme case is Greece. like we saw last class, right? So, and then we are going to see that again today. Okay, so this is regarding to the government budget, right? So those are there's a cost and a benefit. So you can see there's a dedicated balance you need to illustrate. Now let's look at in reality. So what kind of fiscal discipline we have in European countries, among European countries. So they have this fiscal rule. The reason why they have this fiscal rule is back in 1990, they created Euro or Eurozone. Okay. And for those countries, they're going to share the same currency. Now to make sure the sustainability of this same currency, they impose a constraint on each member country, which is, so each country must have a budget deficit below 3%. And they have a good reason to ask them to do that. It's because if each country run a huge deficit, has a huge amount of debt, right? If that's the case, and then so they may end up with some big economic trouble. If they end up some big economic trouble, and the people is going to lose their confidence, people is going to not use their currency, which is euro. All right, but then so this collective collective institutions, like there are many members, right? So if one country not following the fiscal discipline and then have trouble, is going to have created some damage to the euro, and the rest of the country is going to suffer. So that's why they decide, okay, so we are collectively impose a constraint on how much deficit you can run to prevent one country is going to fall in the crisis, and then the rest of the other countries is going to rescue this particular country. Right? So that's the backdrop of their fiscal rule among Euro countries. Right. But then so clearly, so this is going to hinder each member's country's ability to carry out their expansionary fiscal policy when it is needed, like in 2008, right? So those countries we mentioned earlier, right? So they're just going to lose their ability to help the economy. But now this becomes a virtual cycle. If you cannot help your economy, if you don't have the physical capacity to rescue your economy to recover, and then people is going to worry about in the future whether you can recover, whether you can generate sufficient tax revenue to pay off your debt. So maybe just write down the equations, easier for you to understand. Okay, so let's rewrite that equation we have earlier. T plus Q D plus, okay, equal to G plus TR and plus D. Okay, what is the virtuous cycle? The virtuous cycle started with the following. If there's a recession hits, and ideally you want to raise this and reduce this, correct? Okay, so now because 3% of the fiscal rule, you cannot raise this much. Now, if you cannot raise this much, and certainly for this country, not only they cannot raise this much, and not only because of this fiscal rule, also because they have some debt in the past, such as making their room even smaller. If they cannot carry expansionary fiscal policy, meaning so the recession is going to lingering around for a long time, meaning in the following few years or even longer, so they are not able to generate surplus, or they are going to run big deficit, right? Furthermore, that means what? That means so their ability to pay off their debt in the future is going to higher or lower? Lower, right? Because they are not able to recover. They don't have the revenue, they don't have the surplus to pay off their debt. So the lower. If the lower, what happened to Q? It's going to lower, right? Meaning interest rate is going to high. If it's lower, and then so that's going to squeeze this part even further, right? If this is like very high or interest rate is low, yes, if they cannot reduce this, but at least they can just increase borrowing. So it does not push this down further. Correct? So you can see this like a virtuous cycle. Investor, so they have some constraint in their expansionary fiscal policy, and then focus they are going to stay in the recession for a while, and then lose their confidence, and then so don't want to borrow to them, and then so the interest rate is going to higher, meaning so they are going to lose their ability to stimulate their economy further. So you can see there's a virtuous cycle. That is what happened for those Greek countries. All right. Okay, so now let's look at the US. For the United States, we have its own version of this similar fiscal rule, but usually this is like in the state level. In the federal level, we have this debt ceiling. Okay, what's debt ceiling? So debt ceiling actually, its origin dated back to 1917. Because before 1970, if the federal government want to finance some government spending, if they don't have enough tax revenue, what they do is they must pass a very special, for each case, they must pass a legislation to borrow from the public. And since 1917, so they streamlined the process, just impose the debt ceiling as long as your total debt is below that level, and you feel free to borrow. But then, so because the economy grows, right, the size is getting bigger, and certainly the debt is going to accumulate. Like I said earlier, so this debt ceiling has been revised more than 70 times. For the most recent ones, the debt ceiling is close to 100, a little bit more than 120% of GDP. But for the moment, they have not tied the debt ceiling to GDP yet. They only just tell you what the maximum is, like absolute value, not in terms of GDP. But personally, I think to tie it with GDP is a more reasonable and a more efficient way to impose some fiscal discipline. Right. So this is regarding to the budget policy. Right. Now this one is kind of linked. This just circle back to the discussion we just had in the previous slide. This is regarding to Greece. Look at it here. Look at it here. This is their borrowing rate. This is essentially the cost of borrowing for the government. Why it went up? Like I just said, this is like a virtuous cycle. Right. So the investor lost confidence on you. Why they lost the confidence? Because you cannot stimulate the economy. You know why you cannot stimulate the economy? Because you don't have the room to do that. Right? And then so the price is going to rise. So that just make your space even squeezed, has been squeezed even further. This is a virtuous cycle. Right. But from here you can see, so there's a sort of balance. So you impose a very stringent fiscal rule, right? So this is going to, at some point, it's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt them. And also from the case of Greece, you can see to dealing with that is not simple. Let me just go back a little bit and show you the equation. Right? Just look at it here. So now just imagine you have a lot of debt, right? And then so you don't have much room to play. Okay. And then, so what are you going to do? So the solution is you're trying to run some surplus or reduce the deficit, right? But then, so in order to reduce your deficit, what you must do? You must increase tax or reduce government spending transfer, right? And then, so as I asked you earlier, seems like no one likes high tax. No one likes reduce the benefit. Okay, but in reality, what happened is that, look here. So the Greece government was forced to tighten the belt. Why? Because otherwise the government is going to, because they have debt to pay, and the price is so low. If they don't tighten their spending, and then they are going to default. Right? This is like a disaster. So then, so they are going to cut the benefit. But then, so when they decide to, even before they decide to, or this, when they start to announce this cut in spending, so you can see people start to protest, and these things can be very violent. Like recently, the France was trying to do the similar things, but for different reason. Whereas France was trying to raise the retirement age, right? So that's just part of the solution to reduce their deficit. Actually, the long-term deficit. But then what happened? The French went on the street to protest, right? So you can see. So actually, this is another good example to show you the difference between micro and macro. In the macro level, look at it here. So the government should take some austerity, meaning spend wisely. But in the micro level, individuals don't care, or they just cannot care about this big picture. For them, they just care about, okay, so how much tax I pay, how much benefit I'm going to receive, right? It's beyond my capacity or my calculation to care about the long-term future of a big country, right? So there's like conflict between an individual and in the aggregate level. To summarize here, deficit versus debt. Deficit is the difference between what the government has generated in terms of money and what they have to pay for a given period of time. And certainly, so the deficit is going to lead to more debt. Right? Otherwise, how are you going to finance your deficit? Right? So they are linked, but they are not the same things. Okay, deficit causes debt, but more debt is leads to more likely to run a debt. Right? This is amount of debt owned by a selected advanced economy, like the United States in the middle. By the way, this is a little bit outdated. Right now, this is 120%. And by the way, this is percentage of GDP. This is regarding the percent of GDP. So this is probably like 10 years ago. US 81%. Now it's 120%. 120%. Okay, this is US right now. But now you can look at it here, Greece. So you can understand their problem, right? So their debt to GDP ratio is very high. Right. So the high debt level, lower borrowing, so higher borrowing costs, right? So they are forced to take some austerity, but that's just gonna virtuous cycle. And here, so you can see there's only one country among those rich countries. I think worldwide, that's probably the only country. So they have, instead of debt, they have some assets or saving. Okay. Why is that? What makes Norway stand out? Because Norway has lots of sovereign wealth coming from their rich oil reserve. It was discovered like early 20th century. Okay, so that's the only outlier. And usually this country has large amount of debt. Okay. Right here is also want to emphasize, so the debt can not only cause the issue I just mentioned, right? So the debt, the more that you have, and then the less room you have in terms of run a expansion of fiscal policy. And then furthermore, the more that you have, and then the lower the price and the higher the borrowing costs. Right? So this higher borrowing costs actually is going to lead to a crowding out in private investment. That's going to lead to lower long-run economic growth. In the extreme case, the government may default. What is default? It just means they just cannot keep their promise, cannot repay their principal or their interest. If that happens, so that's going to significantly reduce their reputation. And then as a consequence, that's going to increase their borrowing costs. That's going to huge costs. That's why the US government never default. That's why whenever there's a debt ceiling discussion, then they will always find a solution. Okay. Because the cost of default is too high. Right. Again, I'm going to, yeah, so here, so the picture is a little bit slow, it's small. So basically just show you the US debt to GDP ratio. There are two spike. This is during World War II. This is another one. Oh, this is like a projection. So here, this is another spike. This is 2020. Right. So in 2020, because of the COVID-19, right? So the government initiated huge, massive stimulus, meaning so there's a huge deficit, and meaning so the government debt increase. So that's what happened in 2020. And here clearly, because there's a war, you need to finance. Now, furthermore, the third thing I want to emphasize is why they project this is going to rise. That's going to link to the last topic in this chapter. It's called the implicit liability. It's coming up soon. So what is implicit liability? Essentially, it's the government promise to pay. All right, you promise to pay. And furthermore, so this liability is going to increase over time for some reason. This is going to show over here. All right. Now, the other way to look at the debt is look at the deficit. Right? Look, particularly in 2020, look at the size of the deficit. The size of the deficit. Right? But so there are two messages. Message number one, the deficit leads to the accumulation of debt. And by the way, so you look at the scale, right? It's 3 trillion, over 3 trillion in 2020, number one. And then number two, so from this graph, you can see the value of running deficit. Just imagine if 2020, the government was forced to run a budget balance. What would happen? So that's going to make the recession very, very deep. This is what happened in 1929 to be precise, right? Okay, so now the last topic in this chapter is the implicit liability. So this is spending promised by the current government, and eventually it's going to show up partly as a debt. Why? This is because you have to spend, right? So sooner or later it's going to realize. Another thing about this implicit liability is that so this usually spending is going to grow over time. And why they grow over time? Largely because economic growth. Economic growth brings out good things and bad things. Now let's see, so what are those implicit liability? For the US, the implicit liability largely coming from these two government programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. What is Medicare and Medicaid? Primarily, so let's focus on Medicare. What is Medicare? Elderly, okay? So healthcare is expensive, right, in the US. And elderly is more expensive. But certainly you can understand so why there's Medicare. It's because this is a social program to help people to deal with economic hardship, as I explained to you earlier. When you're getting old, you have more healthcare need. Healthcare is expensive, right? So that's why the government comes in. That's what this is the first step. Now, this Medicare, this is like a promise benefit, right? Actually, we pay tax, right? And then so promise, when I'm getting old, I'm going to receive Medicare benefit. This is a promise. Now, the third sense regarding to Medicare is, so this is going to grow over time. Look at it. Look at this projection. This is current, right? So this is probably like 5 to 6% of total GDP. Now, in less than 20 years, this is going to grow to like 7 to 8% of total GDP. Why? Why the Medicare is going to spend more and more money? Partly coming from the economic growth. Economic growth brings prosperity, brings longer life. But if you live longer, fortunately and unfortunately, and then you're going to need more care, right? Because there are many diseases actually happens, or like automatically happens when you're getting old, like civic or cancer, heart disease, or dementia. Right? So that's why, so this implicit liability is going to become an ever-growing burden. This is number one. The other one is Social Security. Similar, Social Security is a promise. Okay? You pay tax, I pay tax. So in our tax return, we're like W-2. So there are two taxes. One is Social Security tax, but the other is Medicare tax. We need to pay tax, and then as a promise, so the government is going to deliver Medicare and deliver Social Security when we turns into 65. Now again, so this economic growth brings prosperity, brings good, and at the same time brings costs. We live longer, and then you have more years to collect Social Security. Not only that, so the economic growth also brings another subtle change in our life, which is the fertility start to decline. You might have heard from news. Like in the US, if you look at the United States, so the fertility rate decline. And if you look at different region, right? Like, for example, in the coast area, their fertility rate is lower. This is actually, there's some strong correlation with economic growth. So actually, this is something I'm going to discuss more intensively in my class in the fall. If you're interested, I will encourage you to take. It's called International Economic Development. Right. In any case, so from here you can see those are promises made by the government. And those promises, I mean, the cost of those promises is going to grow over time. It's going to grow with economic growth. So that part of that eventually is going to translate into ever larger debt, right? Because your tax is kind of, as a percentage of the GDP is kind of fixed. That, and you have other spending, right? So this is implicit liability. And then to deal with this implicit liability is not an easy issue, right? Technically, yes, what you can do, either you increase tax or cut the benefit. Or like in the case of France, recent happened is one. So they just cut the benefit by asking you to work longer. Does people agree? No. Those elderly, not only those elderly protest, there are many young people also protest. Right? As you can see, so technically, yes, you can solve, but in practice, there are so many hurdles. Right? So this is implicit liability. So in that sense, to summarize, so we need to understand the relationship between fiscal policy and I mean the current fiscal policy. Like current need means you may need to stimulate your economy, meaning you need to provide a certain protection to your citizen. But then in the long term, you may face some problem like your debt.